The last train into Dunore Creek should have arrived before sunset, but on that freezing January night it came nearly an hour late, and when the doors finally opened, one woman stepped onto the platform carrying a battered suitcase, a coat too thin for the weather, and a secret that could destroy the most powerful rancher in the county. She had nowhere to sleep, nowhere to go, and no idea that the man who would offer her shelter would soon become the one man she could no longer bear to betray. If you love emotional Wild West stories filled with romance, mystery, and secrets, subscribe to Legend of West right now, because once this story begins, you will want to know how it ends. Marabella Holloway stood alone beneath the weak station lantern while the other passengers hurried toward town. Snow blew across the tracks, catching against her dark wool coat as she stared down at her gloved hands. She had spent 3 days traveling west, but somehow arriving in Dunore Creek frightened her more than the journey itself. Hidden inside the lining of her worn suitcase were several folded papers she had been ordered to deliver. She had been warned not to lose them. She had also been warned not to ask questions. A tall man watching from beside the station office noticed her immediately. Alexander Thornwell was 38, wealthy, widowed, and known across 3 counties as the owner of the largest cattle ranch in the region. He had come to collect legal papers from a shipment arriving on the train. He had no intention of speaking to strangers that evening, but something about the woman standing perfectly still in the storm made him stop. He walked toward her. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. Marabella looked up. Her eyes were calm, but there was exhaustion behind them. "No." Alexander glanced toward the dark road leading into town. "The next train won't come until Thursday." "I know." "Then you have a room waiting somewhere?" She hesitated. "I'll find one." He studied her thin coat before saying, "Mrs. Aldridge keeps a boarding house on Cutter Street. Tell her Alexander Thornwell sent you." Marabella's expression changed for half a second. "Thank you, Mr. Thornwell." Alexander stopped. "I never told you my name." Her face remained composed. "People talk." He said nothing, but he remembered the answer. The next morning, Dunore Creek learned that the stranger was a trained nurse from St. Louis. Her name was Marabella Holloway, and she had come looking for work. Dr. Puett, the town's aging physician, hired her after watching her treat a ranch hand's infected wound with remarkable skill. Within days, Marabella became familiar with the town, but she was careful about becoming familiar with anyone else. Sheriff Cal Briggs questioned her politely, asking why she had traveled so far alone. She gave him answers that sounded complete. She did not tell him about the man in St. Louis who had forced her into this journey. She did not tell him about the land surveys hidden in her suitcase. She certainly did not tell him that one of the letters inside carried a name connected to Alexander Thornwell's ranch. Alexander owned 1,100 acres of valuable grazing land, property that had belonged to his family for generations. Marabella had been told that the documents could prove someone else had a claim to part of it. She had been ordered to place them in the right hands. But after seeing Alexander at the station, she was beginning to wonder whether she had been sent to harm a man who deserved the truth more than he deserved betrayal. A week later, Alexander's foreman Gideon came to Dr. Puett's office with a deep cut across his palm. Marabella stitched the wound while Gideon watched her carefully. "You're the woman from the train," he said. "Yes." "Mr. Thornwell mentioned you." She looked up briefly. "Did he?" Gideon nodded. "Said you knew his name before he introduced himself?" Marabella smiled faintly. Small towns talk. Gideon studied her for another second before leaving. 3 days later, Alexander entered town and happened to meet Marabella outside the doctor's office. He helped her steady a basket of linens she nearly dropped. Their hands touched for an instant. Neither spoke. Then Alexander asked how she was settling in. She told him the town was treating her fairly. He invited her to a gathering at the Harrow Ranch that Saturday. She accepted. That evening, surrounded by music, firelight, and laughter, Marabella experienced something she had not felt since leaving St. Louis. Peace. Alexander was there too. They barely spoke, yet somehow kept finding themselves near one another. Later, they stood together on the porch beneath the cold stars. "You don't seem like someone who ended up here by accident," Alexander said. Marabella looked toward the dark prairie. "Maybe I've simply learned how to survive unfamiliar places." He studied her quietly. She knew then that the man before her was beginning to see through the careful answers she gave everyone else. That night, alone in her room, Marabella removed the hidden documents and spread them across the table. She stared at the papers for a long time. Then she remembered Alexander's face at the station and whispered to herself, "What have I been sent here to do?" By March, winter had finally begun to loosen its grip on Dunore Creek, but Marabella Holloway felt more trapped than she had on the night she first stepped from that frozen train. The town was warming, the roads were turning to mud, and Alexander Thornwell had begun appearing in Dunore Creek more often. Sometimes he stopped at the land office. Sometimes he visited the feed store. And sometimes he happened to pass Dr. Pewett's office at precisely the moment Marabella was stepping outside. Neither of them admitted that these meetings were becoming deliberate. Their conversations were simple: weather, cattle, roads, Dr. Pewett's habit of charging too little. But something deeper had begun growing between them. Alexander had spent 6 years keeping people at a distance after losing his wife, Caroline, to fever. Marabella had arrived carrying a secret she believed would make any affection between them impossible. Then a letter arrived from St. Louis. It contained only a few words. "You have had enough time. Deliver what you were given." Marabella burned the letter immediately. She knew who had sent it. Lewis Mercer had found her months earlier and discovered an old financial obligation she believed had disappeared. He knew how to use it against her. He had threatened to destroy the little life she had built if she refused to cooperate. The documents she carried were his leverage. They contained old land surveys, legal correspondence, and a letter suggesting that part of the land Alexander believed belonged to his family had once been transferred under questionable circumstances. Marabella had been ordered to deliver the papers to someone in Dunore Creek. She still didn't know whether that person intended to expose Alexander or steal from him. Either way, she knew the result could be devastating. She could have left. Instead, one evening in March, she rode out toward Thornwell Ranch. She told herself she was checking Gideon's injured hand. That was partly true, but the real reason was that she could no longer continue living beside a man while hiding the truth from him. Thornwell Ranch was larger than she expected. The main house stood at the end of a long road, built from dark timber and stone, with broad fields stretching beyond it. Gideon met her near the gate and told her Alexander was in his study. Alexander looked surprised when she appeared. "Miss Holloway? I came to check Gideon's hand. His hand is fine." She knew he was not fooled. He invited her inside anyway. They sat in his study while a fire burned behind them. Ledgers covered the desk. The ranch's business surrounded them, but Marabella barely noticed. The papers were inside her bag. Alexander poured coffee for both of them. They spoke for several minutes about the ranch, his father, his grandfather, and the land he had inherited. "You talk about this place like it's more than property," she said. Alexander looked toward the window. "It is. My family built their lives here. I inherited more than land. I inherited responsibility." Marabella lowered her eyes. "What if something you believe about this place isn't true?" Alexander's expression changed. "Then I'd rather know." Silence filled the room. Marabella reached into her bag. Her hands trembled as she placed the folded documents on his desk. "These were brought here because someone wanted to use them against you." Alexander didn't touch them immediately. "Who sent you?" His voice was calm, but the warmth had disappeared. Marabella told him about Lewis Mercer, the threats, the debt, and the order she had received. She told him she had come to Dunore Creek because she had been forced to carry the papers, but she had never delivered them. "Why?" Alexander finally asked. She swallowed. Because you helped me when you had no reason to. You saw a stranger freezing at a train station and stopped. You didn't ask what I could give you. You simply helped me. Alexander opened the documents. His eyes moved slowly across the pages. The first survey showed an old boundary line. The second contained a legal statement dated years earlier. The final letter carried the signature of a man Alexander knew by reputation. For several minutes he said nothing. Then he looked at Marabella. You could have disappeared. I know. Why didn't you? She answered quietly. Because whatever happens to me, you deserve the truth. Alexander leaned back in his chair. For the first time, Marabella saw something vulnerable beneath the controlled exterior of the wealthy rancher. He was not angry with her. He was hurt by the realization that someone had deliberately used her to enter his life. I don't know whether I can trust you yet, he said. Marabella nodded. I understand. She stood. Alexander stopped her before she reached the door. But I know one thing. She turned. You came here to tell me the truth when leaving would have been easier. His eyes held hers. That matters. Marabella felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. She left the ranch believing the worst was over. She was wrong. The next morning, Sheriff Cal Briggs arrived at Thornwell Ranch because someone had broken into the county land office during the night. The only files disturbed were records connected to Thornwell property. And on the floor beside the broken cabinet, Sheriff Briggs found something that made his expression harden. A small piece of dark blue fabric, identical to the lining inside Marabella's suitcase. The piece of blue fabric should have been enough to turn suspicion against Marabella. But Sheriff Cal Briggs had spent 19 years learning that evidence and truth were not always the same thing. He questioned her carefully, and Marabella answered every question without hiding the fact that she had carried the documents into Dunore Creek. She admitted everything except one thing. She had never entered the land office. Alexander stood nearby while the sheriff listened. The wealthy rancher who had once trusted almost no one now had to decide whether to protect a woman who had entered his town under false circumstances. Sheriff Briggs eventually discovered that the fabric had been planted. The real culprit had used a torn piece from Marabella's coat, taken when she had visited the land office several days earlier. Meanwhile, Gideon uncovered something even more disturbing. Lewis Mercer was not working alone. He had been coordinating with a local land speculator who wanted control of Thornwell property. The documents were not meant to expose Alexander's entire ranch. They were designed to create enough legal confusion to force him into selling part of the land cheaply. Marabella had unknowingly been used as the messenger, but her decision to tell Alexander the truth had ruined the plan. For the next 2 weeks, Sheriff Briggs quietly followed the trail. Letters were examined. Old land records were compared. Witnesses were questioned. Eventually, the truth emerged. Alexander's grandfather had legally secured the land decades earlier. The questionable documents were real, but they had been deliberately altered to make the ownership appear uncertain. Lewis Mercer had planned to use the confusion to force Alexander into court and then buy the disputed acreage through a third party. When Mercer finally arrived in Dunore Creek, he expected Marabella to hand over the original papers. Instead, Sheriff Briggs was waiting for him. Mercer was arrested before he could leave town. The local man helping him confessed shortly afterward. Alexander's ranch was safe, but Marabella's heart was not. She believed that once everything was over, Alexander would ask her to leave. She packed her belongings quietly at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house. Before sunrise, she carried her suitcase downstairs. Alexander was waiting outside. You're leaving. It wasn't a question. Marabella looked at him. The reason I came here is finished. That doesn't answer me. She looked toward the road. I lied to you when I first arrived. You were frightened. I still should have told you. Alexander stepped closer. You eventually did. She shook her head. Because I couldn't keep deceiving you. He was silent for a moment, then he said, Do you know what happened to me after Caroline died? Marabella looked at him. People in town told me you became distant. They were right. He gave a faint smile. I decided it was safer not to let anyone close enough to hurt me again. Marabella's eyes filled with tears. And now? Alexander looked directly at her. Now I think being safe and being alive are two different things. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. I don't want you to stay because you feel responsible for what happened, he said. I want you to stay because you want to. Marabella looked toward the Thornwell ranch in the distance. The same place she had once viewed as the destination of a dangerous assignment now looked like something entirely different, a home she had never expected to find. And if I stay? She whispered. Alexander smiled for the first time without sadness behind it. Then we'll see what happens. Spring came fully to Dunore Creek that year. The creek rose with the melting snow, the grass returned across the ranch, and the town slowly forgot the scandal that had nearly cost Alexander his land. Marabella continued working beside Dr. Pewitt, but she also began spending more time at Thornwell Ranch. She treated injured ranch hands, helped the cook when needed, and eventually became part of the household. Alexander changed too. He laughed more. He rode into town without a reason. He stopped avoiding people. And when the townspeople began whispering that the widowed rancher had finally found someone who could make him smile again, he didn't deny it. Months after the night Marabella first stepped from that train, Alexander took her back to the same station. Snow covered the tracks again, but this time she was not alone. Do you remember this place? He asked. Marabella smiled. I remember thinking I had arrived here to destroy your life. Alexander took her hand. Instead, you changed mine. She looked at him. And what about the secret I carried here? He smiled. That secret saved us both. The train whistle sounded in the distance, but neither of them moved toward it. Marabella had once arrived in Dunore Creek with one suitcase, a dangerous secret, and nowhere to belong. Now she stood beside the man she had been sent to deceive, knowing that the greatest surprise of her journey had never been the land, the money, or the hidden documents. It had been finding a man who saw her fear, believed her truth, and gave her a reason to stay. And in the years that followed, whenever someone in Dunore Creek asked how Alexander Thornwell finally opened his heart again, the old-timers always told the same story. It began on a freezing night when a stranded nurse stepped off the last train carrying a secret she was never supposed to reveal, and a lonely rancher decided to stop and ask if she needed help.